of Nova Scotia and Mi'kma'ki, articulated through various treaties, remain unresolved, an unresolved inheritance that all of us who lay claim to progressive politics are committed to working with those with whom we share treaties. And of course, this is a particularly salient issue nowadays, literally today, these days, as the ongoing conflict over sovereignty relating to the Mi'kmaq fisheries versus the non-Indigenous fisheries are here. So we are here to also honor our treaty obligations as good settlers, I suppose, if such a thing is conceivable. So thank you all for joining with us today. We have a pretty tight program and a pretty exciting program. We're going to be profiling some absolutely wonderful books written by members of our research community here. And just in terms of logistics, to help us kind of get through the evening quickly, if you do have questions for our presenters, I would just ask that you post those questions in the comment section, or else hold them until all three presenters have had a chance to say their piece. Each of our presenters are actually aiming to speak for a relatively short amount of time, and Christine Saulnier is going to be posting links that you can follow to find information about purchasing their three wonderful books. We will be hearing today from Dr. Lesley Frank, author of Out of Milk, Infant Food Security in a Rich Nation, Dr. Tammy Finley, co-author of Women, Politics and Public Policy, The Political Struggles of Canadian Women, and Dr. Alexandra Dobrowalski, who is the author of, I've just got to pull up her book here, sorry, Turbulent Times, Transformational Possibilities, Gender and Politics Today and Tomorrow. I think we can probably all agree, in light of all that's been going on, this is a wonderful time to be thinking about these kinds of transformations. Without further ado, and then of course after this we're going to be having our annual general meeting, but first the exciting business. So without further ado, Dr. Lesley Frank will be speaking to us first. She is a professor in the Department of Sociology at Acadia University. She's a leading scholar of infant food insecurity in Canada, with publications in the journals Food, Culture and Society, Food and Foodways, Canadian Food Studies, and the Canadian Medical Association Journal. Her work has been featured on CBC's The Current, and she is a regular media commentator locally on matters related to family poverty. She is a long-standing research associate of the CCPA Nova Scotia office as the author of the annual Child Poverty Report Card for Nova Scotia, which we all rely on quite heavily every year and look forward to. So without further ado, Dr. Frank.
Hi, can you hear me fine?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here virtually to share a bit about my new book, Out of Milk, in this great company. And if you know me, you most likely know me through the CCPA as the author of the Child and Family Poverty Report Card, but you might not know that both the report card and my interest in the topic of this book was born over 20 years ago when I was a prenatal early infancy outreach worker working with low-income families in the Annapolis Valley. In fact, the stories told in this book are all stories of family and child poverty, ones that transfixed me a long time ago, and I've carried it through into my academic life. But they're ones that are rarely heard or discussed as matters of public policy. Infants actually suffer from the highest rate of child poverty in Canada. And as this book demonstrates, they also experience food insecurity through its effects on families, mothers, and infant feeding practices. And so Out of Milk reveals the experiences of mothers struggling to feed their children and the poverty gaps that put babies at risk of going hungry in high-income nation of Canada. So this I implore in the book as an urgent social justice, health equity, and public policy issue. As the first 1,000 days from conception to 2 years is the most critical time for optimizing growth and development. This is also the time when families have the least income. because of our failure to provide adequate income security measures for the labor of feeding, which is part of the work of social reproduction that primarily falls to women. The book explores mothers' experiences of food and infant feeding in food insecure conditions in Nova Scotia. And so with the help of these moms that I interviewed, I was able to narrate a picture of how household, maternal, and infant food insecurity is experienced, thought about, and addressed or not in public policy and in practice. So the book, Out of Milk, is organized around 3 central themes, and it begins by exploring breastfeeding as a food system and a strategy for food security, a theme also echoed in the minimal policy discussions that recognize the relationship between food insecurity and infant feeding. So mothers like Lorraine explained how breastfeeding is a reliable and perfect food system. She said things like, I don't have to worry about the milk. It's free. There's no risk of cross-contamination. It's there, it's ready, it's the right amount. It's the perfect food. And it's a big comfort knowing that my son's going to have milk when he needs it any time of day or night. And Hannah, more fearful, explained that she knew that there was no money and wasn't going to be able to afford formula. And then she said, I need to produce enough milk. I have to. These stories highlight how breastfeeding is thought about as a pathway to infant food security. However, the second theme of the book reveals how food insecurity undermines breastfeeding as a sustainable food system due to maternal food insecurity, a fact completely ignored in our public policy. In Mary's words, she describes why she stopped breastfeeding. She said, I don't know if what I was producing was really enough nutrition-wise. If it was, how would you put it, healthy enough for him, giving him what he needed? Plus, in order to be able to produce milk, a mom needs to be food secure, and you don't have that all the time. The situation could change for you on the drop of a dime. And contesting the idea that breastfeeding's free, Sally points out, you do have to pay because you have to eat in order for your baby to have nutrition. Breastfeeding may be cheaper, but formula feeding still has costs. And finally, the book tells the story of what happens when low incomes during early infancy make infant formula unaffordable and the lakes mothers go to provide for their children. This chapter brings you stories of foraging for free formula. As Hannah describes, you can sometimes get it at the food bank or a church or a family resource center. You take what you can get. It's a matter of being able to feed the baby at all. This is what I get, so this is what they get. And it tells stories of suboptimal feeding outcomes and the contested nature of policy that restricts formula access. So in all, together, the stories in the book show how infant food insecurity is rooted in a succession of public policy failures that puts babies at risk by limiting mothers' ability to feed them, regardless of how they're fed.
Thank you very much for that introduction to this really important work. And again, I would just ask everyone to hold questions until the end. And I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Tammy Finley. Tammy is an associate professor and chair in the Department of Political and Canadian Studies at Mount St. Vincent University. Her research focuses on feminist intersectionality and social policy, childcare policy, and democratic governance. She's the author of the book Femocratic Administration, Gender, Governance, and Democracy in Ontario, and co-author of Women, Politics, and Public Policy, The Political Struggles of Canadian Women, 3rd edition, which she will discuss this evening. She is a research associate at the CCPA Nova Scotia office, sits on the board of ADSUM for Women and Children, and is the incoming president of the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women. Dr. Finlay, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, I first want to thank all of you for coming and taking a break from watching the US election updates to be here with us. I'm trying also not to sneak peeks as we're here right now. I want to also thank Christine for the chance to say a few words about our books. And actually, Christine and Alexandra are featured in the acknowledgements for the book, so this gives me a chance to thank them both in person as well. This is the third edition of Women, Politics, and Public Policy. I should note I wasn't involved in the first two editions, but had used them quite a lot for teaching in the past. So I was really excited to be invited to help update this latest version. The book is intended to act as an introductory text covering three main areas. So the first section provides an overview of feminist theory from so-called classic to contemporary, including liberal, Marxist, socialist, radical, cultural, ecofeminism, post-structuralism, post-colonial and Black feminism, and queer theory. And it addresses issues related to sameness versus difference, epistemology, identity, intersectionality, and transnationalism. The second section considers the different ways that women engage in small and large P politics, namely a chapter on social movements and the women's movement in particular, including addressing movements such as Me Too, Time's Up, and Black Lives Matter. There's a chapter on the policymaking process and the public service, looking at state feminism, gender-based analysis, and gender-based analysis plus, and a chapter on electoral politics. The final section, the third section, walks through specific areas of public policy. So there's a chapter on family and family policy, looking at family law, divorce, child custody and violence. A chapter on reproduction, looking at abortion and assisted reproduction. 2 chapters covering issues related to paid and unpaid work and public policy, including looking at labor market inequality, the valuing of unpaid work, anti-discrimination measures, parental leave, and childcare. It's a chapter on the body, examining questions around beauty and debates about prostitution and pornography. And the book ends with a chapter on globalization that looks at international relations from a gender lens, international advocacy and institutions, political representation, violence, migration, work, health, and trade. So overall, I think it's fitting for our AGM theme, which is political struggles, possibilities, and public policy in unusual times, which probably could have been another title for the book. So that's it for my quick presentation.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Definitely sounds like a really multifaceted book, and I look forward to the discussion about it. Last and certainly not least, friends, is Dr. Alexandra Dobrowalski. Dr. Dobrowolsky is a professor of political science at St. Mary's University and currently is the acting chair of the political science department. She teaches in the area of Canadian politics, comparative politics, and women, gender, and politics. She has published in a range of national and international journals and has written and edited and co-edited 6 books. Wow. She has been an enthusiastic supporter of the CCPA Nova Scotia office, sitting on its research advisory committee for many years, serving as the chair of the RAC, the Research Advisory Committee, and co-authoring a CCPA Nova Scotia report in 2014 called Expanding the Vision, Why Nova Scotia Should Look Beyond Econocentric Immigration Policy. Dr. Dobrowalski, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thanks, Christine, for organizing this panel. Thanks, Ajay, for your host and moderating duties. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks to Tammy for the thanks. And thanks to everyone for being here this evening. I'm going to start with posing a few questions. So what is Justin Trudeau's feminism all about? Is it Facebook feminism, fake feminism, or a much more insidious, complex, and contradictory neoliberal governance feminism? From Jean Ghomeshi to the infamous Halifax taxi driver court cases, do feminism and public dialogue have an impact around sexual assault law? What are some of the perils and promises of #feminism? What lessons can be learned from today's movement politics and issues that arise out of Black Lives Matter or the pink washing of pride parades? And what about the toxic masculinity found in the counter-movement politics of the alt-right? What can gendered Indigenous reproductive justice and refusal tell us about the present and future of extractive politics? Is trans feminist politics at a tipping point? What does it take to include an intersectional understanding of disability in our practices of politics in these turbulent times? These are just some of the many timely and topical questions that are posed and issues that are explored in this featured volume I co-edited with Fiona MacDonald that was published by U of T Press and came out this summer. The genesis for this collection can be found within recent currents of turbulence and transformation that show how gender is central to politics at multiple scales, locally, nationally, and globally. It stems from our desire to offer scholarship grounded in an intersectional approach that is informed by our experiences as feminist scholars and teachers in political science who are rooted in activist progressive politics. To illustrate, my chapter, chapter 1, unpacks how Justin Trudeau's words and deeds reflect multiple versions of liberalism and feminism. Then, these reflect multiple versions of liberalism and feminism. Then key policies ultimately benefit the few, not the many, when gender, race, and class are taken into account. In short, the Justin Trudeau liberals invoke a social liberal equality of old, but act in ways that reflect contemporary social investment priorities and neoliberal feminism. Their social policies typically lack intersectional analysis and serve a particular type of family, white, upper middle class, nuclear, with one stay-at-home parent, or at least a parent whose job is not crucial to the household income. Their immigration policies still facilitate economic migration, human capital, and private sector mandates, despite frames that are more sympathetic to families, refugees, and asylum seekers. In the end, Justin Trudeau's neoliberal feminism may provide a foothold for some, but crowds out alternatives for many others. This is just a snippet from my chapter, but overall, the book contains 17 chapters. It's divided into 2 mutually constitutive sections. Part 1, Transforming Institutions and Ideas, Turbulent Times and Ongoing Struggles. And Part 2, Non-Institutional and Intersectional Politics, Feminisms, Allies, Affect, and Anger. Yet these 2 parts are highly interdependent. Chapters in Part 2 could be in Part 1 and vice versa. This is important because we're challenging the all too common separation of institutional formal politics from movement politics, and we are contesting the siloing and marginalization that typically happens in the discipline of political science. Gender, race, sexuality, disability, indigeneity, size, and so on are typically seen as add-ons or niches rather than being treated as absolutely integral and critical to our understandings of contemporary politics and thus central to political science. In doing so, our book also comes as a response to students' needs and concerns. In developing this edited collection, we were informed by what took place in our classrooms as we witnessed the transformations that happen when students first encounter a framework that makes sense of their lived experiences, or they read subject matter that fundamentally challenges their taken for granted assumptions. We are keeping our comments short, so I'm going to conclude by saying that with this volume, we have brought together diverse scholars from various backgrounds and standpoints at different stages of their careers from across Canada and abroad, as well as from a range of institutions big and small. But what we all share is a critical perspective and what Patricia Hill-Collins and Surma Bilge describe as a commitment to praxis perspective, which means not merely applying scholarly knowledge to social or political problems, but rather using knowledge learned within everyday life to reflect on those experiences as well as on scholarly knowledge. In the end, our most crucial objective with this project and ultimately through this volume is not only to document and critically analyze the nature, causes, and effects of these exceedingly turbulent times, but also to seek to identify transformational opportunities now and into the future. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much for that. So 3 very stimulating micro talks here for us folks. This is the time for questions. We have about 10 minutes before we turn to the AGM. So I would encourage you to please post your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand if you'd like to pose it, but chat box will probably be most expedient. And while you're kind of thinking about a few, why don't I ask one? I'll ask one to Dr. Frank to get us going. Thanks for your talk. And I was wondering, listening to you, and I've heard you on the radio talking about this, and it always makes me so angry to hear about this issue. And I was wondering, is access to food a human right? And if it is, or if it isn't, like, is this something that we can sue the government over in terms of, thinking about infants? Like, if ever there was something that you would think everybody could agree on, this would be it. What do you think?
Well, it's enshrined in international agreements, but it's not something that's been legislated, so that it, therefore, it causes a bit of a conundrum. And I do explore some issues around rights to food in the book, particularly in terms of sort of rights of mothers to be fed themselves in order to be productive producers to be lactators, and the economic securities required to do that labor. I also explore the right for formula feeding, which does raise some contentious, I have experienced, some, not sure if you would call backlash around framing that in a rights to food issue, but it gets caught up in some pretty interesting infant feeding policy dynamics, I would say. So if we make infant formula more accessible, because infants have a right to food, it has caused people to be cautious around whether that will lead to not protecting breastfeeding in the way that it needs to be protected. I mean, I don't see these two things as mutually exclusive
Right.
At all, but and I think the pathway is through the right to food argument. So women have a right to food in order to be producers of breast milk, and infants have a right to food no matter what that food is, and people have a right to choose what that is. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh. But it's not something that's legislated,
right.
Unfortunately.
Thank you for that. I have questions till the cows come home, but I do want to make some space for others. So again, if you do have a question, feel free to raise your hand, post it in the question. I'll just wait a second before moving on to my next question. All right, so I'm going to jump. I was thinking, Dr. Dobrowolsky, about your intervention here, and I was thinking about, I thought identifying Trudeau's neoliberal feminism. I've always called it faux feminism, but I agree with you. Like, it is a neoliberal feminism, and part of that neoliberal feminism is the fact that he wants to self-identify. You know what I mean? Like, it strikes me that he's not claimed by feminist communities necessarily as a feminist, and I'm wondering, in Trudeau being able to at least discursively lay claim to this identity as a feminist, is there something that, perhaps organized feminist movements, is it something that they would be interested in challenging his claim? And what are the steps that, that might open, or the doors that might open in terms of forcing politicians to actually demonstrate their feminism as opposed to lay claim to it discursively?
I think it's a really interesting point, because in one sense, you know, given what came before Trudeau, some feminists would say, well, it's a lot better than Stephen Harper. But when you start to unpack the, you know, what the dimensions of that feminism, Trudeau's feminism that he claims, this is what I'm kind of underscoring in my chapter to say, you know, it tends to be, if you look at the social policies, you know, the classic example here would be how Trudeau dealt with parental leave. So basically extending the amount of time you have for parental leave, but adding no further funds. So who is that going to benefit? That does nothing for single moms. That does nothing with people who are, you know, working poor people. And so again, it's better for some women, but not all women. So that's kind of the point of suggesting that it's like a particular type of woman who doesn't have, you know, similarly, some of his feminist rallying cries, he talks about like more, you know, being more attentive to work-life balance. But again, that's something that even thinking about work-life balance, that's only a luxury for some people to think about work-life balance. So it's clearly a very limited feminism that is, you know, it's a step forward for some women. But if you do take an intersectional approach, you see how many women are not benefiting from this very limited type of feminism.
Absolutely.
I'm sure Tammy has something to say on this too. I'm looking at Tammy. Go, Tammy, go.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, Tammy, maybe I'll pose that then. You know, obviously, if you want to comment on that question too, but I was thinking about that in context of your book and in terms of, you know, even in terms of other like elected feminists, you know, people who might actually be feminists and, you know, yeah, could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, and it is something we talk about in the book. Maybe I'll just give a bit of inside information about putting the book together, and then I'll also talk about that. So as I mentioned, this is a third edition. I wasn't involved in the first two. The second edition came out during the Harper regime. And so the kind of running theme throughout the book, of course, was how damaging this was going to be for, and was, for women's equality. And so as we sort of went through various iterations of this third edition, it started out like what I thought was very like overly optimistic about how things have changed under Trudeau. And so I had to like, I think, work with my other co-authors to dampen that enthusiasm, I think, was probably my role. And so just to pick up on some of the things Alexandra was saying, in the chapters that I specifically contributed to, like we look at the last two budgets, which were supposed to be built with a gender-based analysis plus lens. And in addition to parental leave, which Alexandra already explained and is like probably one of the best examples, the fact that they have had almost no action around childcare at all is also a pretty obvious gap in the kind of policy approach of this government. And yeah, just in general, the claims around having an intersectional lens just don't meet the reality. There are not policy results to back that up. And so that's one of the points that we make in the book in terms of looking at whether these processes like gender-based analysis and gender-based analysis plus are actually producing results, or are they just providing kind of new forms of rhetoric for governments to use and abuse?
No, that's a really good point. It kind of makes me think, kind of just thinking broadly across, you know, these three books. It seems like there's a lot, especially in the political realm, and thinking about our purpose as an organization that is very purposefully trying to shift conversation, you know, in a deliberately progressive area. It's very challenging when people simply discursively lay claim to, you know, a progressive identity. And it seems that in mainstream politics, it's so easy for someone to simply say that. So I was wondering if maybe any of the three of you wanted to say anything further about, you know, ways in which a policy institute like ourselves can force some substance to come from the politicians, as opposed to, you know, just this discursive claim. And actually, maybe this is something that Christine, perhaps you would like to weigh in on as well. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. Any takers on that one? I feel like to some extent that's the existential question that we are always after, right? Like, why can't you solve our problems for us? Okay. All right, well, seeing that we will likely not solve the problem of faux progressives in one evening, I'd like to thank everyone for the three of you for your wonderful presentations, and remind everyone that links to purchase these wonderful books can be found in the chat section. And as we're now rounding out at about 7 o'clock, we're just going to shift gears and move into the AGM component of the evening. So it's never an easy thing to do a round of applause, but I would invite you to give a round of applause for our presenters as much as we can. All right, so now on to business. Oh yes, the emojis always have us covered there, right? So I would like to introduce Alex Stratford, the chair of the CCPA Nova Scotia Steering Committee. And then, yeah, basically what we're going to do today, we have 5 or 6 agenda items that we'll be going through. Alex, will be giving us the chair's report. Govind Rao will be giving us the RAC report. We'll hear a provincial director's report from Christine Saulnier. We'll then hear a financial report from Alec again, and then we'll turn to steering committee nominations with Tammy Finley, and then finally adjourn for the evening. So I'm going to pass it over to Alec, please.
Thanks so much. And thanks everyone to the really powerful books that were put out and the really amazing talk tonight. It's one of those things I know a lot of us are feeling pretty heavy right now with the violence that's happening in Nova Scotia as